The cabin was burning. Not fully, not yet, but smoke curled from the back wall where the fire had caught the dry pine logs, and the smell of it filled every corner of the room like a living thing. Caleb Hawkins knelt on the floor with his back against the overturned table, blood running steady from the hole in his left shoulder, soaking through his shirt and pooling in the creases of the wood beneath him. His right hand, the one missing 2 fingers from Gettysburg, still held the rifle. Still steady, still ready. Outside, hoofbeats circled the cabin like wolves testing the edges of a kill. Eliza stood by the window. The Colt revolver Caleb had taught her to shoot trembled in her grip, but her eyes were dry, and her jaw was set in a way that would have been unrecognizable to anyone who had known her 6 months ago in Connecticut. Her dress was stained with blood. Not hers. "How many?" she asked. Her voice was calm. Terrifyingly calm for a woman who half a year earlier had never held a gun, never ridden a horse, never kissed a man. Silas Drummond sat against the far wall, hands bound behind his back, face swollen purple where they had beaten him. His amber eyes burned through the bruising. 3, maybe 4. Boone is out front. Caleb pulled back the hammer on his rifle. The click was the loudest sound in the room. "Then let Boone come to the front." This is how it all ended. A burning cabin on a Montana mountainside, a virgin bride holding a pistol, and 2 mountain men, 2 men she loved with everything she had bleeding because of her. But to understand how a schoolteacher from Connecticut ended up here holding a Colt ready to kill, we need to go back 6 months. To the letter that changed everything. 6 months earlier. Hartford, Connecticut. The letter arrived on the day Eliza Prescott sold her mother's piano, the last possession of a family that had once existed. She stood in the empty parlor of the house on Maple Street and watched 2 men carry the upright Steinway through the front door, its legs scraping the threshold her father had painted white every spring for 20 years. The sound it made was like a cry. Eliza did not cry. She had used up her tears 3 months ago, standing in the cemetery rain while Reverend Dawson read scripture over her father's pine coffin, and she had decided then that tears were a currency she could no longer afford. She was 22 years old. Her mother had died when she was 14, taken by consumption in the winter of 1870, leaving behind a daughter who could read Latin, play Chopin, and recite the Sermon on the Mount from memory. Her father, Reverend James Prescott, had raised her alone after that, a quiet man with kind eyes and no talent whatsoever for money. He preached every Sunday at the Second Congregational Church, visited the sick on Wednesdays, and spent the rest of his time reading theology books he could not afford. When he died, he left Eliza 2 things: a mountain of debt she did not know existed, and a leather-bound book of American law, worn soft at the spine, with a note tucked inside the front cover in his careful hand. The Bible teaches you to live right. The law teaches you to demand justice. You will need both. She sold everything. The furniture went first, then the books, then the china her mother had carried from England. She sold her mother's wedding ring to a pawnbroker on State Street who gave her $4 for it and did not meet her eyes. She sold her winter coat. She sold her second pair of shoes. And still the debt remained patient and absolute like a stone at the bottom of a well. The creditor, a Mr. Harold Finch with a gray mustache and grayer conscience, gave her 30 days. The letter arrived on day 19. It came from a place called Elk Ridge, Montana Territory, written in a careful but unsteady hand on paper that smelled of wood smoke and distance. The writer identified himself as Reverend Wallace Hartley, minister of the Elk Ridge Community Church, and he was writing on behalf of a man named Caleb Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins, the letter explained, was a good and decent man, a former soldier, a hunter and trapper who had built a fine cabin on the mountain above town. He was not young, 33 years of age, and he was not what anyone would call handsome, but he was honest, capable, and ready to provide for a wife. He required a woman of education and moral character. He had heard through church correspondence networks that Reverend Prescott's daughter might be in need of a new beginning. Eliza read the letter 3 times. Then she sat down at the empty kitchen table, the one piece of furniture too damaged to sell, and wrote her reply. The letters went back and forth for 4 months. Hartley wrote on Caleb's behalf since Caleb's own writing was rough and sparse, though he did send one letter himself. It was short, barely a paragraph, and the handwriting looked like it had been carved into the paper with effort and determination rather than skill. It said only this: Miss Prescott, I am not good with words, but I keep my word. If you come, you will have a home. You will be safe. I will make sure of it. C. Hawkins. Along with the letter came a small pencil drawing. A face, angular jaw, deep-set eyes, a scar running from the left temple down to the cheekbone. Not handsome, but strong. The kind of face that had seen things and survived them. Eliza sent back her daguerreotype. A small oval portrait showing a young woman with chestnut brown hair pulled back from a pale, narrow face. Large blue-gray eyes that took up too much of her features. A mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile but remembered how to endure. She did not know, as she sealed the envelope, that the letter she had received was not written by Caleb alone. She did not know that Caleb was not the only man Reverend Hartley had tried to match. And she did not know that the life waiting for her in Montana was nothing, absolutely nothing, like the one described in those careful, smoke-scented pages. She packed her single valise, one dress, one change of underclothes, her father's law book, a pressed flower from her mother's garden that had been tucked inside her Bible since she was 15. She bought a coach ticket with the last of her money and sat in the cramped leather-smelling darkness for 19 days as America scrolled past the windows like a story she was reading for the first time. The Great Plains, the endless grass, the rivers whose names she did not know, and finally, the mountains, rising from the earth like the spine of something ancient and sleeping snow on their peaks. Even in September, forests so dark and thick they looked like they had never been entered by human feet. Montana territory. She had never been more than 50 miles from Hartford in her life. Elk Ridge materialized out of the dust and distance like a mirage that had decided to become permanent. 200 souls, give or take, clustered in a valley between two mountain ranges. One main street unpaved, thick with mud from recent rain. A general store with a sagging porch. A saloon with no name, just a painted bottle on the sign. A church so small it looked like it was praying to the mountains for permission to exist. And beyond it all, rising in every direction, the wilderness. Pine forests that went on forever. Peaks that vanished into cloud. Air so clean and cold it hurt her lungs. Reverend Wallace Hartley was waiting at the coach stop. 68 years old, white-haired, with the trembling hands of a man whose body had outlived his certainty. He smiled when he saw Eliza, but the smile did not reach his eyes. Something behind those eyes was moving, something that looked like guilt. Miss Prescott, thank the Lord you arrived safely. The journey must have been exhausting. It was long, Eliza said, but I am here. Yes, yes you are. Hartley's gaze dropped. His hands fidgeted with the brim of his hat. Miss Prescott, there is something I need to tell you before we proceed further. A complication. The word landed in Eliza's stomach like a stone. What kind of complication? Hartley explained. Slowly, painfully, with the halting cadence of a man confessing a sin he had not meant to commit. His eyes were bad, he said, had been going bad for years, and his hands shook, which made his writing unreliable. He had been corresponding on behalf of two men, not one. Both Caleb Hawkins and another man, Silas Drummond, lived together in the same cabin on the mountainside. Both had asked Hartley to find them wives through the mail correspondence networks. Hartley had written to two different women, but the second woman had withdrawn at the last moment, sending a letter that arrived after Eliza was already en route. And somehow, through the confusion of failing eyes and trembling hands and letters that crossed in transit, both men had come to believe that Eliza Prescott was coming to be their wife. Both of them, Eliza said. The world tilted slightly. Both of them. I take full responsibility, Miss Prescott. It was my error, my terrible, foolish error. So who is my intended husband? Hartley's face crumbled. Legally neither. You have not signed papers, but both men are expecting you. Both men have prepared. Both men believe you are theirs. Eliza stood in the mud of Elk Ridge's only street and felt the last solid ground beneath her feet dissolve. She had no money to return, no home to return to, no family waiting anywhere. Behind her was nothing, and ahead of her were two strangers on a mountain, each one holding a letter with her name on it. She had three choices: go back to Connecticut to debt and destitution and the slow death of a woman with no prospects and no people. Choose one of the two men sight unseen based on nothing but a guess, or go up that mountain, meet them both, and decide for herself. "Take me to them," she said. "I did not travel 2,000 miles to turn around before I have seen the road ahead." That was the bravest sentence Eliza Prescott had ever spoken, but it would not be the last. Hartley also said something else before they started the climb. His voice dropped low, and he leaned closer as though the mountains themselves might overhear. "Miss Prescott, I should tell you more. Caleb Hawkins is a good man, but he does not talk much. He saw things in the war that no man should see, and Silas is warm-hearted and kind, but some nights he screams in his sleep. They are both good men, but they are both wounded." There was something else behind Hartley's words, a shadow of something he was not saying. Eliza could feel it the way you feel a storm coming before the sky changes. But Hartley sealed his lips and turned toward the mule cart, and the moment passed. What Hartley did not tell her, what he could not bring himself to say, was that Silas Drummond carried a secret far more dangerous than nightmares. And that secret was already riding toward Elk Ridge on a black horse 200 miles south in the form of a man who hunted other men for money. The trail up the mountain was steep and narrow, carved into the slope by years of boots and hooves and meltwater. Pine trees pressed close on both sides, their branches interlocking overhead like the fingers of clasped hands. The air smelled of resin and cold earth and something else, something wild and unnamed that Eliza had never encountered in Connecticut. It was the smell of a world that did not care whether you survived it, a world that would be beautiful whether you were there to see it or not. The cabin appeared around a bend in the trail, and Eliza's breath caught. It was larger than she had expected. 2 stories built of heavy logs fitted together with obvious skill. A wide porch running the length of the front, overlooking the valley below. Stone chimney rising from one end, a thin thread of smoke curling from its mouth. Whoever built this place knew what they were doing, knew how to make something that would last. He was on the porch, chopping wood. Caleb Hawkins brought the axe down with precise, economical force. No wasted motion, no performance. Just the clean geometry of a man doing necessary work. He was tall, 6'2" at least, and lean in the way of wire cable, no softness anywhere, just tendon and sinew and bone wrapped in weathered skin. His hair was black, thick, falling past his collar. His eyes, when he finally looked up, were gray-blue, the color of lake ice, and they cut through the distance between them with the focused attention of a man sighting down a rifle barrel. The scar. She recognized it from the drawing, a long, pale line running from his left temple to his cheekbone. Gettysburg, she would learn later. A bayonet that had missed his eye by the width of a finger. His left hand, she noticed as he set down the axe, was missing 2 fingers. The ring finger and the small finger taken by a Minié ball in the same battle. He was 33 but looked older. War ages a man from the inside out, and whatever Caleb Hawkins had been before the fighting, that person was gone. He looked at Eliza. Not at her body, not the way men in town sometimes looked at women, appraising curves and calculating worth. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand. His gaze moved from her face to her hands, small, pale, uncalloused, clearly hands that had never worked outdoors, to her single valise, and there it lingered. She had brought her entire life in a bag that small. "Miss Hayes," he said. The name was wrong. Hartley must have garbled it in one of his letters, but the uncertainty in Caleb's voice was real. "Prescott. Eliza Prescott." He nodded once, filing the correction without apology. "Come inside. The trail up here gets cold." No pleasantries, no small talk, no welcome speech. He picked up her valise with his wounded hand, 3 fingers gripping the handle with the same steady competence he brought to everything, and walked inside. Action instead of words. She would learn that this was Caleb's only language. Inside the cabin was clean, surprisingly clean for 2 men living alone on a mountain. The main room served as kitchen and living space, a large stone fireplace dominating one wall, a cast-iron stove for cooking shelves holding supplies, and to Eliza's surprise, a small collection of books. She recognized Dickens. She recognized a Bible. There was a hunting rifle mounted above the door and a rocking chair near the fire that looked hand-built and well-used. And on the windowsill, a jar of wildflowers. Purple and yellow mountain wildflowers arranged with clumsy care. They were slightly wilted, as though they had been picked several days ago when news of the coach arriving early had not yet reached the mountain. Someone had prepared for her coming. Someone had thought about what a woman might want to see when she walked through the door for the first time. Eliza stared at those flowers and felt her throat close. She did not know which of the 2 men had picked them. She would not ask. But the gesture, small and imperfect, cracked something inside her that she had been holding together since her father's funeral. She did not have time to examine that crack because the back door opened with a bang and everything changed. Silas Drummond came through the door carrying half a deer across his shoulders, the way another man might carry a sack of flour. He was enormous. 6'4" shoulders wide enough to fill the doorframe with the kind of raw physical power that made a room feel smaller just by his being in it. His hair was mahogany brown, thick and slightly wavy, falling around a broad face with a neatly trimmed beard. His eyes were the first thing that truly stopped Eliza. They were amber. Not brown, not hazel, but genuine amber, the color of whiskey held up to firelight. Unusual. Intense. And right now those eyes were lit up like lanterns. "Well now," he said, his voice a warm rumble that seemed to come from his chest rather than his throat. A grin split his face wide and unguarded. "My bride is here." The air in the cabin froze solid. Caleb, who had been placing Eliza's valise near the stairs, went absolutely still. His hand, the one still holding the bag, did not move. His jaw locked. His ice-colored eyes went dark. "Your bride," Caleb said. The words came out quiet, dangerously quiet. "She is my wife." Silas's grin vanished. He set the deer carcass down slowly, deliberately, the gesture of someone who has just realized the room holds a different kind of danger. "What are you talking about? Hartley said she was coming for me." Hartley said she was coming for me. Both men turned, not toward Eliza, toward each other. And in that turning, Eliza saw something she had not expected. These 2 men were not strangers living under the same roof for convenience. The way they squared their bodies, the way their eyes locked with the familiarity of men who had stood side by side through things that words could not hold, told her that whatever bond existed between Caleb Hawkins and Silas Drummond went deep, years deep, blood deep. And now that bond was cracking down the center, and she was the fault line. Reverend Hartley, still standing near the door, began to shrink. "Gentlemen, please. It was my error. My eyes, my hands, the confusion with the letters." "Show me," Caleb said, assessing her the way he might read a shifting sky. Both men produced letters, both on the same paper, both in Hartley's shaking hand, both bearing the name Eliza Prescott, both containing the same promise. Silas read his aloud. His voice, so warm moments ago, had gone cold. "Miss Eliza Prescott has agreed to become your wife and will arrive on the September coach." He looked at Caleb's letter. The same words, the same name, the same lie that was not a lie but an old man's mistake. Silas slammed his fist on the table. The wildflower jar jumped. "This is not possible." Caleb said nothing. He stood perfectly still, the way a man stands when he is calculating every possible outcome and finding none of them acceptable. His eyes moved from Silas to Hartley to Eliza, and in that sweep Eliza saw something shift. Not anger. Something worse. Resignation. As though he had always known that anything good would eventually be taken from him, and here was the proof. Eliza stood up. She was 5'3". She weighed less than either man's saddle. She had dirt on her hem and dust in her hair and 19 days of coach travel in her bones. But when she stood, something in the room changed. Both men felt it. Hartley felt it. Even the fire in the hearth seemed to lean closer. "Stop," she said. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "Both of you, I am not a horse to be fought over. I am not a prize to be divided. I traveled 2,000 miles. I sold everything I owned. I will not be chased away or split like spoils. Give me 1 month. I will meet both of you, understand both of you, and then I will decide. Not you, me." Silence, long and deep and full of things that had no words yet. Caleb spoke first. A single nod. "Fine." Silas, after a moment that stretched like rope under weight, exhaled. "Fine." Hartley, relief washing over his old face, added a warning that landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. The first snow usually falls by the end of October. When the snow closes the trail, the road down to town will be impassable until April. You have 6 weeks, Miss Prescott. 6 weeks to choose a man. But what Eliza did not know, what none of them knew, was that winter was not the only threat approaching this cabin. 200 miles south, on a trail that wound through territories where law was a suggestion and justice was a luxury, a man on a black horse was asking questions, asking about a big man with red-brown hair and strange amber eyes, asking about someone named Drummond. The conditions were set that first evening with the stiff formality of a treaty negotiation. Eliza would sleep in the upstairs bedroom. It had a lock. Caleb and Silas would remain downstairs. No one would touch her without her clear and spoken permission. Hartley would ride up to check on them each Sunday. That first night Eliza lay in the narrow bed upstairs and listened to the cabin breathe. The creak of logs settling. The distant howl of something coyote or wolf she could not tell. And below her the sound of 2 men not speaking to each other, the silence between them louder than any argument. She pressed her face into the pillow and thought, "What have I done?" The first week was a study in contrasts. Caleb rose before dawn every morning. By the time Eliza came downstairs, the fire was built, coffee was hot, and he was already outside checking trap lines, splitting wood, moving through the day's work with the silent efficiency of a machine designed for survival. He did not make conversation at breakfast. He did not ask about her sleep or her comfort or her feelings. But every morning the best piece of bread was on her plate. The coffee nearest the fire, where it would stay warmest, was hers. The chair closest to the heat was pulled out for her. He said nothing about these arrangements. If she thanked him, he nodded once and looked away as though kindness embarrassed him. One evening she woke to a sound she could not identify, a soft, rhythmic scraping that might have been a mouse or the wind. She came halfway down the stairs before she realized what it was. Caleb was sitting alone by the dying fire. He was sewing. The curtain in her room had a tear in it. She had noticed it the first night, and here was Caleb Hawkins, former Union soldier, mountain man, a man who could drop a deer at 300 yards, sewing that curtain with his 3-fingered hand. The stitches were clumsy, uneven, but careful. So careful it made her chest ache. He looked up and saw her watching. For one unguarded moment his face showed everything: the loneliness, the wanting, the absolute certainty that he did not deserve what he wanted. Then the mask came down, and he was stone again. "Curtain had a rip," he said, as though that explained everything, as though it explained nothing. Silas was a different universe. He cooked every meal and cooked beautifully game stew with wild herbs, biscuits that rose like prayers. Coffee so good Eliza suspected witchcraft. He sang while he worked in the kitchen, old mining songs with melodies that wandered like mountain trails. He told stories at supper tales from his years prospecting in California, living with the Crow Nation, wandering the territories with nothing but a bedroll and a stubborn refusal to die. He asked Eliza questions about Connecticut, about her father, about the books she had read, about what she thought of the mountains, about whether she preferred sunrise or sunset. He made her laugh, the first real laugh she had produced in months, maybe years. It burst out of her like a bird escaping a cage, and the sound of it made Silas's amber eyes glow with something that looked dangerously like love. But at night Eliza heard him screaming. Not every night, but often enough. The sounds came from below, muffled by the floor between them, but unmistakable. A man trapped in a dream he could not escape, calling out a name she did not recognize, thrashing against something invisible and terrible. In the mornings after those nights, Silas smiled as though nothing had happened, but his eyes were dim and his hand shook when he poured the coffee. Caleb never mentioned the screaming, but on those mornings Eliza noticed he made sure Silas ate, set the plate in front of him, poured his coffee first, said nothing. But the gesture said everything. She watched them together when they thought she was not looking. Small things. The way Caleb left the door unlatched when Silas was running late from the trap lines because he knew the sound of Silas's particular knock and would not make him wait in the cold. The way Silas always set 3 plates at supper, even before Eliza arrived, because the 3rd place had been Caleb's, and muscle memory is stronger than arithmetic. The way they moved around each other in the small cabin without collision, a choreography built over 6 years of shared space and shared survival. The way Caleb knew what Silas needed before Silas spoke. The way Silas knew what Caleb was thinking by the set of his jaw. Their bond was deeper than friendship. Not romantic, not exactly, but something that the English language did not have a convenient word for. Something forged in blizzards and bear attacks and the long silence of mountains that did not care whether you lived or died. They had saved each other's lives. They had built this cabin with 4 hands, 3 of which had the normal number of fingers. They were brothers in every way except blood. And now a woman stood between them, and the question of who she would choose was a blade pressed against a bond that had survived everything else. 2 weeks passed. The aspens on the mountainside turned gold and then orange, and then began to let go of their leaves one by one like hands releasing things they could no longer hold. Eliza found herself doing something she had not expected. She was falling, not for one of them, for both, in completely different ways, for completely different reasons, and with a growing horror that what she felt was not a choice between 2 options, but a truth that had no acceptable shape. Caleb was safety. Caleb was the locked door, the loaded rifle, the man who would stand between her and any threat without hesitation or calculation. His silence was not coldness. It was the silence of a man who had used up his words in screaming on battlefields and now saved what was left for things that mattered. When he spoke, it was truth compressed to its smallest possible form. When he acted, it was with a competence that made the impossible look routine. She felt protected near him, not controlled, not diminished, but sheltered, the way a tree shelters without trapping. Silas was warmth. Silas was the fire on a frozen night, the voice in a silent room, the laughter that reminded you that survival was not enough if you forgot how to live. His stories were not just entertainment. They were invitations. Come in, they said. You belong here. When he looked at her with those amber eyes, she felt not just seen, but understood. He knew what loneliness tasted like. He knew what it meant to build a self from nothing after everything had been taken. And the horrible, wonderful, impossible truth was this: she needed both. One without the other was a house with no fire or a fire with no house. And every day that she spent in this cabin, watching these 2 men being cared for by these 2 men, the idea of choosing one and losing the other felt less like a decision and more like an amputation. Then the fever came. It was the end of the 2nd week. The afternoon was cold but clear, and Eliza had gone down to the creek to wash clothes, a task she had taken on as her contribution to the household. The rocks were slippery. Her foot caught. She went down hard into water that was barely above freezing, soaking through to the skin in an instant. She managed to pull herself out and stumble back to the cabin, but by evening she was shivering uncontrollably. By nightfall, her temperature was climbing past the point of reason. The nearest doctor was 40 miles away. The rain had turned the trail into a mudslide. No horse could make that journey in the dark without breaking a leg or a rider's neck. They were on their own. Caleb's face went blank when he touched her forehead and felt the heat radiating from her skin. It was the blankness of a man who had watched people die before and recognized the opening moves. Silas went pale beneath his beard. For a moment, neither man moved. Then training took over. Caleb had field medical knowledge from the war years of patching gunshot wounds and setting broken bones under fire. Silas knew herbal medicine from his time with the Crow remedies passed down through generations of people who had healed without hospitals for centuries. They worked together. The argument about Eliza, the tension about the letters, the question of who she would choose, all of it evaporated like water on a hot stove. There was only the sick woman and the need to keep her alive. Caleb propped her up to ease her breathing, his arm behind her shoulders, her body limp against his chest. He changed the cold cloths on her forehead every few minutes, methodical, relentless. When the fever spiked and her eyes rolled back, he held her upright and talked to her, a low, steady stream of words that made no sense individually, but together formed a rope she could hold on to in the dark. Silas prepared medicine: willow bark tea for the fever, nature's aspirin, echinacea root, wild honey mixed with warm water to keep her hydrated. He crushed the herbs with his massive hands, hands that could bend iron, working with a delicacy that seemed impossible for a man his size. The fever climbed, higher, dangerous now. Eliza's body burned like a stove, and the cloths on her forehead dried almost as fast as they could wet them. Caleb made the decision. They needed to cool her body directly. That meant removing the sweat-soaked nightgown. That meant seeing her. They were careful. They were respectful. They looked away when they could, touched only what was necessary, handled her body with the clinical tenderness of men who understood that trust was being placed in their hands like something made of glass. But the cabin was small, and the lamp was bright, and there was no way to avoid the intimacy of what they were doing. They saw her, the pale skin flushed pink with fever, the small breasts rising and falling with labored breath. The curve of her waist, the flat plane of her stomach, the dark chestnut hair spread across the pillow like autumn leaves on water. And she, in her delirium, saw them, felt them. Caleb's rough hands gentle now, replacing cloths with movements so careful they made her want to weep. Silas's warm palm on her forehead, checking her temperature for the 100th time, his amber eyes tight with fear. In the worst of it, when the fever peaked and the room swam, and Eliza could not tell the difference between waking and dreaming, she reached out, both hands, and found them, Caleb on her right, Silas on her left. She gripped their fingers with a strength that should not have been possible for a woman that sick, and she whispered words that would change everything. "Do not go. Do not leave me alone." The two men looked at each other across the bed. Amber eyes met gray-blue. Between them, the woman they both loved was burning alive, holding on to both of them like they were the only solid things in a world that had turned to smoke. Caleb spoke. His voice was rough, barely above a whisper. "A mountain man's bride does not die from fever. Not here. Not while we are with her." He said mountain man, singular. But he was looking at Silas when he said it, and Silas understood. They stayed awake through the entire night. Caleb held her upright when her breathing rattled. Silas fed her willow bark tea, one spoonful at a time. They took turns with the cold cloths, with the water, with the quiet words that kept her tethered to the world of the living. At some point in the small hours when the fire had burned low and the cold crept in from every crack, Eliza's fever began to break. Her breathing eased. Her grip on their hands relaxed. The burning flush faded from her skin, replaced by a gentle warmth that was exhaustion rather than illness. Dawn came. Eliza opened her eyes to gray light filtering through the window and the sensation of being held on both sides. She was lying in the large bed downstairs, the one the men usually shared. Caleb was on her right, his wounded hand still wrapped around hers, his head tilted against the headboard at an angle that would punish his neck for days. He was asleep. The lines in his face had softened. Without the rigid control he maintained while awake, he looked younger, vulnerable, almost gentle. Silas was on her left, his massive arm draped protectively across the blanket, his mahogany hair falling across his forehead. His chest rose and fell with the deep rhythm of a man who had finally surrendered to exhaustion after fighting it for hours. Even in sleep, his body was angled toward her, shielding her from the cold side of the room. Eliza lay between them. She did not move. She listened to them breathe, one rhythm deep and slow, the other shallow and watchful, even in sleep. She felt Caleb's three-fingered hand, rough as tree bark, curled around her right palm. She felt Silas's warmth radiating through the blanket like a banked fire. And she knew. She knew with a certainty that bypassed logic and propriety and every rule she had ever been taught. She did not want to let go of either hand. The fever had broken something open, the last wall of formality and distance that had allowed her to pretend this was still a rational decision between two candidates. It was not rational. It had never been rational. You do not choose between air and water. You need both. You die without either. 4 weeks remained before the snow would close the trail, and Fletcher Boone had just crossed the Montana border. The days after the fever were quiet in a way that changed the shape of silence itself. Before, the silence in the cabin had been careful, watchful, the silence of 3 people trying not to touch something that might burn. Now it was different. The fever had stripped away pretense the way fire strips bark from a log, leaving the raw wood underneath pale and exposed and impossible to ignore. Caleb no longer pulled his hand away when it accidentally brushed against Eliza's. The contact would happen, his fingers grazing hers as he passed the coffee pot, his shoulder touching her arm as they stood in the doorway watching the valley below. And instead of the sharp withdrawal that had characterized their first 2 weeks, there was a pause, a stillness. His hand would linger for half a second longer than necessary, and then move on. It was not much. But from a man who rationed every gesture the way a soldier rations water in hostile territory, it was everything. Silas changed too. He had always been physically comfortable around people, the kind of man who stood close, who touched shoulders and arms in conversation without thinking about it. But with Eliza, he had been holding back, maintaining a careful distance that was clearly costing him effort. Now that dam had cracked. He sat beside her by the fire in the evenings, close enough that their arms touched. He rested his hand on the small of her back when she stood at the stove. He tucked a loose strand of chestnut hair behind her ear one morning without thinking, and only realized what he had done when she looked up at him with those wide blue-gray eyes, and neither of them could breathe for a moment. Eliza was recovering. Still weak, still needing rest in the afternoons, but stronger each day. Strong enough to come downstairs for all meals. Strong enough to sit on the porch in the thinning autumn sun and watch the world turn gold around her. Strong enough to notice things she had been too sick or too formal to notice before, like the way Caleb and Silas existed around each other. One evening, unable to sleep, she crept down the stairs for water and stopped on the landing. Below in the firelight, Silas was sitting cross-legged on the floor, mending Caleb's shirt. His massive hands that could crush stone, moved the needle with delicate precision. Caleb sat in the rocking chair, a book open in his lap, reading aloud. His voice stumbled over the longer passages, the words clearly more difficult for him than tracking a deer through heavy timber, but he pressed on with the same stubborn determination he brought to everything. It was the best of times, Caleb read slowly. It was the worst of times. Sounds about right, Silas said without looking up from his stitching, and both men smiled. It was a private smile, the kind that exists only between people who have shared enough to build a language no one else can speak. Eliza stood on the landing and watched them, and she understood something that made her chest feel simultaneously too full and too empty. These 2 men were not simply roommates or business partners, or even brothers in the conventional sense. They were each other's person. The one you turn to when the world strips everything else away. The one whose breathing you know in the dark. Whatever name you put on it, whatever category the world demanded, the bond between Caleb Hawkins and Silas Drummond was as real and as necessary as the logs that held up the roof over their heads. And she was standing in the middle of it, not breaking it, but changing its shape, the way a river changes shape when a new tributary feeds into it. Not smaller, bigger. 3 weeks before the snow closed the trail, Somewhere south, Fletcher Boone was asking questions in a trading post, and a man who traded beaver pelts was about to sell the location of Silas Drummond for $5 silver. The kiss happened on a Tuesday. Silas was teaching Eliza to fish. The creek below the cabin ran fast and cold, catching the afternoon light in flashes of white and silver, and the air smelled of pine and wet stone and the particular sweetness of autumn decay. Silas stood behind her, showing her how to cast his arms around hers, his hands over her hands, guiding the movement of the rod with exaggerated patience. "You are thinking too much," he said. "Casting is not arithmetic, it is a conversation. You ask the water where the fish are, and then you listen." "The water is not saying anything," Eliza said. "That is because you are talking over it." She laughed. He laughed. And for a moment the world was nothing but sunlight on water and the warmth of his body behind hers and the sound of laughter echoing off the canyon walls like something the mountains wanted to keep. Then Silas went quiet, the kind of quiet that has weight. "Eliza." He had never used her first name before. It sounded different in his mouth, richer, more real. She turned. He was close. So close she could count the flecks of gold in his amber eyes, could see the tiny scar on his upper lip, could smell wood smoke and leather, and something underneath that was just him. "I need to tell you something," he said, "about why I left the Crow, about what I did." Eliza waited. "There was a man," Silas said. His voice had changed. The warmth was still there, but beneath it something heavy was moving like a river under ice. "A mine foreman in Nevada. His name does not matter now. He hurt someone, a woman, a young Crow woman who had done nothing wrong. He hurt her in a way that there are no words that make it smaller than it was." Silas's hands had curled into fists at his sides. The knuckles were white. "I stopped him. Not gently. He lived, but not comfortably. And he told the law I robbed his mine, which I did not. But his word against mine, a drifter with no people, and now there is a warrant. $200 for Silas Drummond, wanted for robbery." He paused. His amber eyes searched her face with a desperation that made him look for the first time since she had known him young and terrified. "I should have told you sooner. Before everything. I was afraid you would leave." Eliza looked at the scar on his knuckle, the white line of damaged skin that she now understood. She reached out and traced it with her fingertip, and Silas's breath stopped. "You saved a woman," Eliza said. "I nearly killed a man. To save a woman." He had no answer for that. Eliza rose on her toes and kissed him. It was gentle questioning, ready to stop if he pulled away. He did not pull away. He kissed her back with the careful hunger of a man who has been starving for something he did not dare name, and Eliza felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the riverbank. Her first kiss. It tasted like wood smoke and creek water and the particular sweetness of a secret shared. But Silas had only told her half the truth. He had not told her about the warrant's bounty, about the man named Fletcher Boone, who collected warrants the way other men collected debts, or about the shadow behind Boone the mine owner named Harlan Voss, who had the money and the connections to make law enforcement do whatever he wanted. Those pieces of the truth were still buried, and they were about to be dug up by someone far less gentle than Eliza Prescott. 3 days later. Midnight. The cabin was dark except for the glow of banked coals in the fireplace, and Eliza could not sleep. She padded down the stairs in her bare feet and found Caleb sitting alone in the rocking chair sharpening a knife. The blade caught the ember light in rhythmic flashes as he drew the stone along the edge. He did not look up when she entered, but he knew she was there. He always knew. She sat in the chair across from him. The silence stretched between them, comfortable and uncomfortable at the same time, like a garment that almost fits. "I know about Silas," Caleb said. Eliza's pulse spiked. "Know what?" "That he kissed you." The words hung in the air between them. Eliza opened her mouth to explain, to defend, to apologize, but Caleb cut her off with a small shake of his head. "I am not angry at him." A long pause. The knife stone stopped. "I am angry at myself." Eliza waited. I wanted to do it first." The words came out like they were being extracted with pliers one at a time, each one costing him something. "But I did not know how. Silas knows how to talk, how to tell stories, how to make you laugh. I only know how to be here." He placed his hand flat on his chest, the three-fingered hand. The gesture was awkward, almost childish, and it broke Eliza's heart in a way that nothing in her 22 years had prepared her for. "I have not spoken this many words about what I feel in 15 years, Caleb continued. "Maybe ever. I do not know how to be what Silas is. I do not know stories. I do not know jokes. I cannot carve you birds from wood or sing while I cook. All I know is that I would die for you. I knew it the moment you stepped down from that coach, and I do not know what to do with that." Eliza crossed the space between them. She took his face in her hands, the scarred cheek rough against her palm, and she kissed him. It was nothing like kissing Silas. Silas had been warmth and sweetness and the feeling of coming home. Caleb was a fire that had been burning alone in a sealed room for years, and when the door opened, the oxygen hit the flames and everything ignited. He kissed her with 15 years of silence and loneliness, compressed into a single point of contact, his three-fingered hand coming up to cup the back of her head, his mouth desperate and demanding and shaking all at once. When they broke apart, both of them were trembling. "I have kissed both of you now," Eliza whispered. "I will not pretend otherwise, and I will not apologize." Caleb looked at her. In the ember light, his gray-blue eyes held something she had never seen there before. Not resignation, not anger, understanding. "I know," he said. "I know what you are going to say. Then let me say it anyway." The next morning, Eliza sat both men down at the kitchen table. Caleb on one side, Silas on the other, and herself across from them both. Her hands were flat on the wood, steady by force of will. "I came here to choose one of you," she said. "That was the agreement. 1 month, one decision, but I need to tell you the truth because if this family, if whatever this is, starts with a lie, it will die of the same disease." She took a breath that went all the way to the bottom of her lungs. "I cannot choose. I have tried. Every night upstairs I have made arguments, drawn lists, weighed one set of qualities against another like a merchant weighing grain. And every time I arrive at the same impossible conclusion. I need both of you. Not the way you need 2 horses when one is tired, not as a compromise. I need Caleb the way I need solid ground. And I need Silas the way I need warmth. If I choose one, I lose the other, and I lose a part of myself that I did not know existed until I came to this mountain." Silence. The cabin held its breath. Silas spoke first. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I do not want to choose. I am saying I want to stay with both of you. I am saying that every rule I was taught in Connecticut tells me this is wrong, and every true thing inside me tells me it is right." Another silence. Longer. Deeper. Then Caleb, slow and deliberate, the way he did everything, said something that changed the shape of the room. "The Crow people that Silas lived with, some of their warriors shared a wife, not because there were not enough women, because love is not something that runs out when you pour it into more than one vessel." Silas stared at him. "You know about that." "I have lived in Montana for 8 years. I know many things." Eliza looked between them. "Is that a yes?" Caleb held her eyes. "It is not a no." Silas's amber gaze moved from Eliza to Caleb and back. Something crossed his face. Relief. Hope. And something else. Something that had been hiding behind his easy smile for years. A longing that was not just for Eliza, but for this. For a family that included everyone he loved under one roof, without pretense, without choosing, without loss. "No one owns anyone," Silas said. "That is the only rule." "That is the only rule," Eliza agreed. Caleb said nothing, but he reached across the table and placed his 3-fingered hand over Eliza's, and Silas placed his enormous hand over both of theirs, and for a moment the 3 of them sat there in the morning light, hands stacked like stones in a cairn, marking a trail that no one had walked before them. They had agreed on one thing, but before the first winter ended, they would belong to each other completely. by body, by heart, and by blood. 2 weeks before the snow closed the trail, and Fletcher Boone had entered Montana Territory. The first snow fell 3 days after the agreement, early even by Montana standards. Heavy wet flakes that turned the world white in hours and sealed the mountain trail as effectively as a locked door. By morning the drifts were knee-deep and still building. The temperature plummeted to 30 below. The world contracted to the size of the cabin, and the space between its walls and the 3 people inside it had nowhere to go but closer to each other. That first night it happened the way inevitable things happen. Not with grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but with the quiet accumulation of small movements that taken together constituted a crossing from one kind of life into another. A bottle of whiskey by the fire. Silas telling a story about a grizzly bear he had once talked out of eating him, which Eliza suspected was only 40% true. Caleb's hand on her knee, not moving, not requesting, just resting there with the patient weight of something that had been waiting a long time. The fire crackling, the snow falling, the world outside ceasing to exist. Eliza turned to Caleb and kissed him. Then she turned to Silas and kissed him. Then she stood up and walked to the large bed that the 2 men had shared for 6 years, and she looked back at them from the doorway. "I have never done this," she said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were not. "Any of this. I need you both to understand that, and I need you both to be patient." They were patient. Silas, who Eliza had expected to be bold, was gentle beyond anything she could have imagined. He asked permission with his eyes, before every movement paused, at every sharp breath kissed away the tears that came when her body opened for the first time to accept another person inside it. His hands, those enormous hands that could bend horseshoes, trembled against her skin as though she were something sacred he was afraid of breaking. Caleb was quiet. Of course he was. He held her hand through the parts that hurt his gray-blue eyes, never leaving hers, and when she gasped or tensed, he said the same 2 words each time. "I am here." That was all. But those 2 words in that rough voice were enough to anchor her to the earth when sensation threatened to sweep her away entirely. And there was a moment between the intensity and the tenderness, when Eliza saw something that expanded her understanding of love beyond anything she had been taught. Silas reached out and placed his hand on Caleb's shoulder. Caleb leaned his head into the touch just slightly, barely a fraction of an inch. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds. But in those 2 seconds, Eliza understood that the bond between these 2 men was not just friendship and not just brotherhood, but something that existed in a space where language had not yet learned to go. And whatever that bond was, it was not threatened by her presence. It was completed by it. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the big bed while the blizzard screamed outside. Eliza in the middle, as she would always be in the middle. Caleb's arm across her waist. Silas's breath warm on her shoulder. She stared at the ceiling and felt her heart beating in a rhythm she did not recognize. Not fear. Not guilt. Not the shame that every minister's daughter should feel after doing what she had just done with not 1 but 2 men who were not her husband. What she felt was whole. The winter sealed them in, and the cabin became a world. Days folded into weeks, and weeks folded into a rhythm as natural and necessary as breathing. Caleb hunted. He would leave before dawn, moving through the frozen forest with the silent economy of a predator, and return hours later with rabbit or deer, or once an elk that took all 3 of them to butcher. He maintained the cabin with obsessive care, patching drafts, reinforcing the roof against the weight of snow, ensuring the woodpile never dropped below a 2-week supply. His competence was total and quiet, and absolutely without display. He did not work to be seen. He worked because the people he loved needed to be warm and fed and safe, and this was the only language in which he knew how to say it. Silas cooked. He turned the game Caleb brought home into meals that had no business being as good as they were, given the limited ingredients available on an isolated mountain in the dead of winter. He sang. He told stories that lasted entire evenings. He carved not just the small bird he had made for Eliza, but a chess set piece by piece, teaching Eliza the game and cheating outrageously and laughing when she caught him. He was the warmth in the cabin that the fireplace alone could not provide, the voice that filled the silences that might otherwise have become oppressive. Eliza read to them Dickens, Shakespeare, the Bible on Sundays, because habit runs deep in the daughter of a minister, even when faith has been complicated by circumstance. She taught both men to write more fluently. Silas took to it eagerly, filling pages with his sprawling handwriting, composing letters to no one in particular, just for the pleasure of putting words on paper. Caleb was more reluctant, but Eliza discovered him practicing late at night when he thought everyone was asleep, his three-fingered hand gripping the pencil with fierce concentration, forming letters with the same stubborn precision he brought to everything. One night she found a folded paper on her pillow. In Caleb's rough, careful hand it read, "You asked me what I was fighting for at Gettysburg. I did not know then. I know now." She pressed the paper to her chest and cried, not from sadness, from the overwhelming realization that she was living inside a love story that no one in Hartford would believe and no one in Hartford would approve of, and she did not care. She did not care at all. The screaming happened on the coldest night of January. Eliza woke to Silas thrashing beside her, his massive body convulsing, his voice producing sounds that were not words, but the raw material from which words are made before they are shaped by reason. A name emerged from the chaos. A woman's name, over and over, rising in pitch, cracking at the edges. Caleb was already awake. He was on Silas's other side, his hands on Silas's shoulders, holding him down with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this many times before. "Wake up," Caleb said, not gently, a command. "You are here. You are safe. Come back." Silas's eyes snapped open, amber wild, not seeing the cabin or the bed or the two people leaning over him. For a terrible moment he was somewhere else entirely. Then recognition flooded back, and with it something that looked like shame. "The dream again," he said. Not a question. Caleb released his shoulders. "The dream again." Eliza put her hand on Silas's chest. His heart was hammering so hard she could feel it through his rib cage, a trapped animal throwing itself against bone walls. "Who is she?" Eliza asked. "The name you call." Silas closed his eyes. When he opened them, the amber had gone dark, the color of old honey, the color of something preserved but not alive. "Her name was Mary, Mary Spotted Elk. She was the woman I saved, or tried to save. The foreman Kessler, he had her for 2 days before I found out. 2 days." His voice cracked on the number. "I hear her in my sleep, not screaming, asking, 'Why did it take you so long?' and I cannot answer, because there is no answer that makes 2 days less than what they were." Eliza held him while he shook. Caleb sat on the other side, silent, his hand on Silas's arm. The three of them stayed that way until the shaking stopped and the first gray light of dawn touched the windows. Afterward, Silas told them everything, not just the beating of Kessler, the full story. How Kessler was not a lone predator, but a man with protection. How the mine he managed belonged to a man named Harlan Voss, a silver baron with political connections in 3 territories. How Voss had used those connections to issue the warrant for robbery, a charge designed not to seek justice, but to silence the man who had exposed what Kessler really was. How the bounty of $200 was not just reward money, but a message. You do not touch what belongs to Harlan Voss. Eliza absorbed this information with the quiet focus of a woman reading a legal document, which in a sense she was. "This Voss," she said, "he is the one behind the warrant, not the courts. The courts do what Voss tells them to do in Nevada. But we are not in Nevada. We are in Montana territory. Warrants travel, Eliza. So does evidence." Silas looked at her. Something shifted in his amber eyes. Not hope exactly, but the absence of hopelessness which is its own kind of beginning. The conversation about Silas's secret should have been the crisis point of that winter. It was serious, dangerous. A wanted man meant that the cabin, their home, their impossible fragile family was balanced on a foundation that could crack at any moment. But in the weeks that followed, something unexpected happened. The truth, instead of weakening them, made them stronger. Secrets are weight, and weight carried alone will break a spine, but weight distributed across 3 backs becomes something you can walk with. Caleb's response to the revelation was characteristic and immediate. He cleaned every gun in the cabin. He set tripwire alarms on the trail leading up from the valley. He established sight lines from every window and identified the best defensive positions inside and outside the structure. He did not discuss these preparations. He simply made them the way a man builds a wall before the flood, not because he wants to fight the water, but because the people behind the wall cannot swim. Silas, freed from the burden of his secret, began to sleep better. Not perfectly. The nightmares still came. But less often, and when they did, he woke to find 2 people beside him instead of 1, and the darkness retreated faster. Eliza, for her part, began to study. She pulled out her father's law book, the leather-bound volume that had survived the journey from Connecticut, and she read, not casually, systematically, territorial law, federal jurisdiction, the legal mechanics of warrants and extradition, and the rights of the accused. She read by lamplight while the men slept, her finger tracing the dense paragraphs, her mind building structures of argument the way Caleb built structures of wood, one sound piece at a time. She did not tell them what she was preparing for. Not yet. Some weapons are most effective when they are not displayed until they are needed. The snow began to thin in March. The trails were still impassable, but the worst of the winter was behind them, and the world outside the cabin was beginning to remember that it existed. Meltwater ran in the creek. Birds appeared. The elk came down from wherever elk go when the world freezes, moving through the lower meadows in herds that Caleb watched from the porch with the patient attention of a man cataloging resources. And then, on a morning in early April, when the trail was still muddy but finally passable, the thing they had been preparing for arrived. 4 men on horseback appeared at the bend in the trail below the cabin. Caleb saw them first. He always saw things first. He was on the porch replacing a hinge on the door, and his hand stopped moving the way a deer stops moving when it hears a branch crack. He set down the hinge, picked up the rifle that was never more than arm's length away, and called inside one word low and flat. "Riders." Silas appeared at the back door. He had been splitting logs behind the cabin, and his shirt was damp with sweat despite the cold. His eyes found the riders, and his face went white beneath the beard. He recognized one of them before the horses were close enough to see faces clearly. Something about the way the lead rider sat his horse, the particular stillness of a man who was in no hurry because he already knew how this would end. "Boone," Silas said. Fletcher Boone rode at the front of the group. 48 years old, lean as a whip, with small dark eyes set deep in a face that looked like it had been carved from old wood with a dull knife. He wore a long leather coat that had seen more weather than most buildings, and he carried himself with the patient confidence of a man who had done this many times before. Hunting men was not a passion for Fletcher Boone. It was a trade. He was good at it, the way a blacksmith is good at shaping iron through repetition and the systematic elimination of error. Beside him rode 2 men whose names did not matter because they were not men in any meaningful sense. They were instruments, heavy-armed and paid to do what Boone told them to do. The 4th rider stayed back near the tree line watching. Eliza noticed him from the window. He was different from the others, better dressed, cleaner. He watched the proceedings with the detached interest of an investor observing a return on capital. Eliza did not know his name then. She would learn it later, a clerk sent by Harlan Voss to ensure his money was being well spent. Boone stopped his horse 20 feet from the porch. He tipped his hat with a gesture so polished it could almost pass for genuine courtesy. "Morning. That is a fine cabin you have there, Hawkins." His eyes moved past Caleb to the doorway where Eliza had appeared, and his smile widened. "And a fine wife. A man with a home like this and a woman like that should be careful about the company he keeps." Caleb's voice was flat as a frozen lake. "State your business." "My business is simple." Boone reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "I have a warrant for the arrest of Silas Drummond. Robbery of the Voss Silver Mine, Nevada Territory. $200 bounty authorized by federal jurisdiction." He paused, letting the words settle. "I also have this." He produced a badge. U.S. Deputy Marshal. It gleamed in the morning light. "That badge," Caleb said. "When did you start wearing it?" "Does it matter? I have the authority. I have the warrant, and I have the men." Boone's smile was patient, surgical. "Hand over Drummond and this ends clean. Nobody gets hurt. Your wife keeps her reputation. Everybody goes home." His eyes found Eliza again. "But if you refuse, I take all three of you to Virginia City. And when we get there, people are going to ask questions. Questions about why a young woman is living alone on a mountain with two unmarried men. Questions that do not end well for women, no matter how the answers come out." The threat was double-edged. Not just Silas's freedom, Eliza's honor. In 1878, a woman's reputation was not a luxury. It was a survival mechanism. Lose it, and doors closed. All doors. Permanently. Eliza felt the fear hit her like cold water. For a moment, just a moment, she was the girl from Connecticut again, small and unprotected, and utterly at the mercy of a world that had rules she had not written and could not change. Then she thought of her father's law book. She thought of the weeks she had spent reading by lamplight while the men slept. She thought of the note inside the front cover. "The law teaches you to demand justice." She stepped off the porch. Caleb made a sound, a low, sharp intake of breath that was the closest thing to protest his nature would allow. Silas, who had moved to the cabin doorway, said her name like a warning. But Eliza walked forward, her spine straight, her chin lifted, carrying her father's law book in her right hand. "My name is Eliza Hawkins," she said. The lie came out as smooth and solid as truth. "I am the legal wife of Caleb Hawkins. This is our home. Silas Drummond is my husband's cousin residing with us as family, which is both common and unremarkable in this territory." Boone's smile thinned. "That does not change the warrant, Mrs. Hawkins." "The warrant," Eliza said, opening the law book to a page she had marked with a pressed wildflower, "requires the signature of a federal judge with jurisdiction. Not a mine owner, not a territorial magistrate, a federal judge." "May I see the document?" Boone hesitated. That hesitation was all Eliza needed. "Because if the warrant you are carrying was signed by Harlan Voss or anyone acting on his behalf rather than by a sitting judge of the federal bench, then it is not a warrant at all. It is a piece of paper. And a piece of paper does not give you the right to enter my home, threaten my family, or remove anyone from this property." Silence. The wind had stopped. The birds had stopped. Even the horses stood still as though the mountain itself was listening. Boone looked at her. Really looked at her for the first time since he had arrived. She was 5'3". She weighed 110 pounds. She was holding a book, and she had just put a crack in the foundation of everything he had come here to do. "You have read some law, Mrs. Hawkins," Boone said. His voice had lost its polish. The iron underneath was showing. "My father was a man of God," Eliza said. "He taught me that Scripture and statute both serve the same purpose, to protect the powerless from the powerful. Now get off our land." Boone did not move immediately. He sat his horse, and he looked from Eliza to Caleb, whose rifle had not wavered, to Silas, whose fists were clenched at his sides, to the fourth rider at the tree line, who gave a small shake of his head. Then Boone smiled. It was the worst smile Eliza had ever seen, the smile of a man who has lost a round, but not the fight. "I will come back," he said, folding the warrant and sliding it into his coat, "with proper paperwork, with a real judge's signature. And when I do, Mrs. Hawkins, your law book will not save anyone." He turned his horse. The two men followed. The fourth rider lingered a moment longer, his eyes on the cabin, cataloging it, memorizing it, and then he too was gone, swallowed by the tree line and the shadows between the pines. Eliza watched them disappear. Her hand, the hand holding the law book, was shaking so violently that the pages rattled. She sat down on the porch steps. The book slipped from her fingers and fell open on the wood. Caleb sat beside her. He did not speak. He placed his three-fingered hand over her trembling one and held it there steady and warm until the shaking stopped. Silas stood in the doorway. His face looked like something that had been broken and not yet reassembled. "I should leave," he said. "If I go, Boone follows me. You two are safe." Caleb's response was a single word, a word that had the weight of a mountain behind it. "No." Eliza lifted her head. Her eyes were red but dry. "No one leaves. We are family. Family fights together." "He will come back," Silas said. "With real papers this time, with men, with guns." "Then we need to be ready," Eliza said. "We need two things. A marriage certificate with Caleb's name on it, which means we ride to town and we marry today. And we need something the law cannot dismiss. We need a witness." "A witness?" Silas repeated. "The woman you saved, Mary Spotted Elk. If she testifies that Kessler assaulted her and that you intervened, the robbery charge collapses. No jury in any territory will convict a man for defending a woman against her attacker. Not if the woman stands up and tells the truth." Silas's face changed. "You want to find Mary." "I want to find Mary. She is with the Crow. The Crow move with the seasons. They could be anywhere from here to Yellowstone." "Then someone needs to go to Yellowstone." Caleb looked at her. In his gray-blue eyes she could see the calculation running. He knew what she was about to say. He knew it the way he always knew things about her, not because she told him, but because he watched her the way he watched the weather, constantly carefully reading the signs that other people missed. "I will go," Eliza said. Both men began to protest at once, Silas loudly, Caleb with a single sharp shake of his head. But Eliza raised her hand, and somehow that small gesture, a schoolteacher's gesture, a gesture designed to quiet children, was enough to silence two of the most dangerous men in Montana Territory. "I am the only one who can go," she said. "Caleb, you need to stay and protect Silas. If Boone comes back while you are gone, Silas is defenseless. And Silas, you cannot ride into any town between here and Yellowstone without risking recognition. I am the one no one is looking for. I am the one who can read and write and argue with authority. I am the one who can convince a frightened woman to ride 400 miles to testify in a territory where her people have been given no reason to trust the law." The logic was unassailable. That did not make it easier. They rode down to Elk Ridge the next morning. The wedding was small and fast. Reverend Hartley, hands shaking worse than ever, performed the ceremony. Eliza wore her only dress. Caleb wore his only clean shirt. Silas stood as witness, his jaw tight, his amber eyes burning with everything he could not say in a church. Afterward, Caleb signed the marriage certificate. Eliza Prescott became Eliza Hawkins in the eyes of the law and the territory and anyone who chose to ask. That night, back at the cabin, Silas placed something in Eliza's palm. A ring carved from deer antler, smooth and white and beautiful in its simplicity. "This is my ring for you," he said. "It is not legal, but it is real." Eliza put it on her right hand. She already wore Caleb's ring, a simple gold band purchased that afternoon in the Elk Ridge General Store, on her left. 2 rings, 2 men, 1 family. Caleb handed her the Colt revolver the next morning, then the hunting knife, then a small leather pouch containing ammunition, dried meat, and enough money for supplies. "You carry these," he said, "and you come back." "I promise." His jaw tightened. His gray-blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made the air between them feel solid. "Do not promise. Just do it." She kissed him. Then she kissed Silas. Then she mounted the horse that Silas had saddled and loaded, and she rode down the mountain trail without looking back, because she knew that if she looked back, she would not be able to leave. Behind her, 2 men stood on the porch of a cabin on a mountainside, watching the woman they both loved disappear into the trees. Caleb's hand was on the rifle. Silas's hand was on the porch railing, gripping so tight the wood creaked. Neither spoke. There were no words for what they were feeling. Only the silence of men who have placed their hearts in the hands of someone riding away from them, and the terrible faith required to believe she would return. Somewhere to the south, Fletcher Boone was opening a letter from Harlan Voss. Inside the envelope was $500 in banknotes, a genuine United States Marshal badge, and a single line of instruction written in neat, careful handwriting. Bring Drummond, alive or dead, double for dead. Boone held the badge up to the light and watched it gleam. Now, he said to no one in particular, we have the law on our side. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and the mountain man's virgin bride was riding straight into its path. Eliza Prescott Hawkins had never been alone, not truly alone, not in the way that the wilderness enforces. In Hartford, there had always been walled streets, the sound of other people's lives pressing in from every direction. On the mountain there had been Caleb and Silas, the cabin, the certainty that no matter what happened outside, someone was within shouting distance. Now there was nothing, just the horse beneath her, the trail ahead, and a silence so vast it had weight. The first day she rode 12 miles, and every one of them was a lesson. Her thighs burned from gripping the saddle. Her lower back ached from hours of posting on uneven ground. The trail, such as it was, wound through dense pine forest, where the shadows pooled thick as water, and the branches reached for her like hands. Twice she lost the path entirely, and had to backtrack, reading the ground the way Caleb had taught her, looking for the packed earth and broken twigs that marked where horses had passed before. She made camp that evening beside a creek, built a fire the way Silas had shown her, knocking the back of her knife against flint until sparks caught the dry grass, and ate jerky while the darkness came down around her like a closing fist. She did not sleep. Every sound was amplified by solitude. The crack of a branch became a footstep. The hoot of an owl became a warning. The wind through the pines became a voice saying things she could not quite make out. She sat with the Colt in her lap and her back against a fallen log and watched the fire until dawn grayed the sky to the east. By the second morning she had learned something important about fear. It does not go away. You do not defeat it. You simply move forward with it sitting on your shoulder like a bird you cannot shake off, and eventually you stop noticing the weight. She reached Elk Ridge by midday on the second day. The town looked different now that she was seeing it as a departure point rather than a destination. Smaller, more fragile. A handful of buildings crouched in a valley that the mountains could swallow without effort. She went to the general store first, buying supplies with the money Caleb had given her. Dried beans, coffee, ammunition for the Colt, a wool blanket that smelled like lanolin and dust. Then she went looking for someone who knew where the crow had gone. The trader's name was Guthrie. He ran a small operation on the edge of town, buying furs from trappers and selling goods to anyone who came through, white or Indian, with the cheerful amorality of a man who believed that money had no color. He was missing most of his teeth and all of his hair, and he smelled like cured leather and old sweat, but his eyes were sharp and his knowledge of the territory was encyclopedic. "The crow," he said, scratching the place where his hair should have been, "moved south 2 months ago, following the buffalo. Could be anywhere between the Yellowstone River and the Bighorn Basin. You are looking for one particular crow. A woman named Mary Spotted Elk. She would be about 25, educated at a mission school, speaks English." Guthrie's eyes narrowed, not with suspicion, but with the commercial instinct of a man who recognized information as currency. "That is specific. You in some kind of trouble, Mrs. Hawkins?" "Not yet, but I will be if I do not find her." Guthrie studied her for a long moment. Then he leaned back and shouted into the room behind the counter, "Pete, someone here needs to talk to you." The man who emerged from the back room looked like a piece of the mountain that had decided to walk around on 2 legs for a while. Old Pete Brennan was 62 years old, with white hair that fell past his shoulders, a beard that could have housed small wildlife, and a limp that he navigated with the practiced ease of someone who had been compensating for it so long it had become part of his natural gait. His left leg was shorter than his right by almost 2 inches, the result of a grizzly bear encounter 20 years prior that had ended with the bear dead and Pete's leg never quite the same. But his eyes. His eyes were the youngest thing about him, bright blue, alert, amused by something that no one else could see. They took in Eliza with a single sweep, assessing her the way he might read a shifting sky, noting the dust on her clothes, the colt on her hip, the set of her jaw that said she was afraid, but had decided that fear was not a reason to stop. "You want to find the crow," he said, not a question. "I need to find a woman named Mary Spotted Elk. She is a witness in a legal matter. A man's life depends on her testimony." "Whose life?" Eliza hesitated. Then she decided that if she was going to trust this man with her safety in the wilderness, she should start by trusting him with the truth. Silas Drummond. He saved Mary from a man who was hurting her. Now there is a warrant for his arrest on false charges, and the only person who can prove the charges are false is Mary. Pete Brennan looked at her for a long time. His blue eyes did something complicated, moving through surprise and calculation, and what might have been recognition settling finally on something that looked like respect. "I knew a Caleb Hawkins once," he said, "years back, during the war and after. Watched a skinny Virginia kid turn into something that scared men twice his size. He's still up on that mountain. He is my husband." Pete smiled. It was the smile of a man who has lived long enough to see patterns in the chaos and occasionally be pleased by what he finds. "Hawkins married. Well, the world does change." He reached behind the counter and picked up a battered leather satchel. "I speak Crow. I know the trails between here and Yellowstone better than I know my own face. And I am old enough that I no longer have any business turning down an adventure just because it might kill me." "I cannot pay much," Eliza said. "I did not ask for much. I asked for an adventure. You just handed me one." He limped toward the door, then paused. "How well do you ride?" "Well enough." "Can you keep up with an old man on a bad leg?" "Can you keep up with a young woman with something to lose?" Pete Brennan laughed. It was a sound like rocks rolling downhill, rough and unstoppable. "I like you, Mrs. Hawkins. Let us go find your crow." They rode south for 10 days. Pete was a different kind of teacher than Caleb or Silas. Caleb taught by example, doing things correctly and expecting you to watch and learn. Silas taught by explanation, talking through every step with warmth and patience. Pete taught by doing things wrong on purpose and then letting you figure out why they were wrong. He would choose a campsite too close to the water and wait for Eliza to notice the animal tracks and realize that drinking spots attract predators after dark. He would build a fire too large and wait for her to understand that in open country, fire is a signal as much as a source of warmth. He would ride the wrong direction for half a mile and wait for her to read the landmarks and call him back. "I am not teaching you to survive," he said one evening over a fire that Eliza had built herself, small and efficient and sheltered from the wind by a rock formation she had chosen. "Surviving is what rabbits do. I am teaching you to think. Thinking is what keeps you alive long enough to matter." He told her about Caleb. Not the Caleb she knew, the silent mountain man with the scarred face and the wounded hand, but the boy before him. A 17-year-old from the Blue Ridge Mountains who had walked away from his family and everything he knew because he believed that owning people was wrong. Who had fought at Gettysburg and Wilderness and Petersburg. Who had held dying boys in his arms and written their names in a notebook that he carried until the pages were too blood-stained to read. He came west after the war because there was nothing left for him in Virginia, Pete said. His people called him traitor. The army called him honorably discharged. He called himself nothing, just walked into the mountains and kept walking until the mountains told him to stop. Pete poked the fire with a stick. Finding Silas saved him. Those two, they are not like other men. They do not need the world. They built their own. "And now I am in the middle of it," Eliza said. "You are not in the middle of it, girl. You are the reason it works." They found the crow on the 11th day. The camp was in a broad valley near the Yellowstone River where the grass was already green with early spring growth and the river ran fast and brown with snowmelt. 50 lodges, maybe more, arranged in a pattern that spoke of a social order Eliza did not understand but recognized as intentional. Horses grazed in herds on the surrounding hills. Children ran between the lodges. Smoke rose from cooking fires carrying the smell of roasting meat and something herbal and sweet. Pete spoke to the camp's leader through a combination of Crow language and hand signs that Eliza watched with fascination. The conversation was long. Occasionally the leader, a middle-aged man with braids wrapped in otter fur and a face that suggested he had heard every story the world had to tell and found most of them predictable, would glance at Eliza. His expression did not change. Finally Pete turned to her. "He says Mary Spotted Elk is here. He says she does not want to speak to white people. He says she has her reasons." "Tell him I understand her reasons. Tell him I am not here to take anything from her. I am here to ask her to save a man who once saved her, and tell him that I will wait as long as she needs me to wait." Pete translated. The leader studied Eliza again longer this time and said something that made Pete's eyebrows rise. "He says you speak like someone who has been hurt and decided not to let it make you small. He says Mary will decide for herself." They waited. An hour, then 2. The sun moved across the sky and Eliza sat on the ground beside her horse with her hands in her lap and did not fidget, did not pace, did not display the impatience that was burning a hole in her chest. She waited the way Caleb would have waited, the way the mountains waited, with stillness that said, "I am here and I am not leaving." Mary Spotted Elk appeared without announcement. One moment Eliza was watching the river, and the next moment a woman was standing 10 feet away as though she had materialized from the grass itself. She was 25, small-boned, but with a wiry strength that showed in her forearms and the set of her shoulders. Her hair was black and fell to her waist. Her face was striking high cheekbones, dark eyes that held intelligence and damage in equal measure. She wore a combination of traditional Crow clothing and mission school remnants, a cotton blouse under a deerskin vest, as though she existed between two worlds and had decided to take what she needed from both. She looked at Eliza and said in clear, precise English, "You know Silas." "I love Silas," Eliza said. There was no point in anything other than the truth. Mary's expression shifted, a hairline fracture in the composure. "He saved me." "I know. And now someone is trying to destroy him for it. A man named Fletcher Boone is carrying a warrant issued by Harlan Voss. The charge is robbery. We both know there was no robbery. But without a witness, without you, Silas will be taken back to Nevada and convicted on the word of the man who hurt you." Mary's hands had clenched at the name Voss. Her dark eyes went somewhere far away, somewhere Eliza could not follow and did not want to. When she came back, her voice was flat. "You want me to stand in a white man's courtroom and tell white men what another white man did to me?" "Yes." "They will not believe me." "They will believe you because you will tell the truth, and the truth has a sound that is different from lying, and because I will be standing beside you when you say it." Mary looked at her. A long look, the kind that reads not words, but the architecture behind them, the foundation on which the words are built. What she found there, Eliza did not know. But after a silence that lasted long enough for the shadows to shift, Mary Spotted Elk said, "When do we leave?" They rode back together, Eliza, Mary, and old Pete. 3 people who should never have been traveling companions by any logic the world recognized, moving north through territory that was still half wild, sleeping under stars that did not care about warrants or courtrooms or the complicated mess that human beings make of love and justice. Mary was quiet for the first 2 days. She rode well, better than Eliza, with the natural seat of someone who had learned to ride before she learned to walk. She observed everything and commented on nothing. On the 3rd day she spoke. "Silas cried," she said, "after he pulled Kessler off me, after the beating. He sat on the ground outside the shack and he cried. I had never seen a man that large cry. It was the reason I trusted him. Men who feel enough to cry after violence are not the men you need to fear." Eliza thought of Silas weeping in the cabin after his secret was revealed, his massive body shaking, tears vanishing into his beard. She nodded. "He screams in his sleep," Eliza said. "Your name. He dreams of you." Mary closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet, but her voice was steady. "Tell him to stop. Tell him he came in time. That is the truth. 2 days is not 2 years. I survived. I am here. Tell him the guilt is heavier than what happened, and he needs to set it down." They reached Elk Ridge on the 18th day. Eliza went straight to the cabin, pushing the exhausted horse up the mountain trail with an urgency that bordered on recklessness because something was wrong. She could feel it the way animals feel earthquakes, a vibration in the air, a wrongness that had no name but every sense. The cabin came into view, and her heart stopped. Smoke. Not chimney smoke. The wrong color, the wrong density pouring from the back wall where flame had caught the dry logs. The front door hung open at a broken angle. On the ground near the porch a man lay face down in the mud. Not Caleb. Not Silas. One of Boone's men, she realized, recognizing the heavy build and the cheap boots. He was not moving. Inside sounds. Scuffling. The thud of something hitting wood. A voice she recognized as Boone's giving orders. Everything that happened next took perhaps 90 seconds. Eliza would remember it for the rest of her life in the stretched and sharpened way that moments of absolute clarity burn themselves into memory, every detail, precise, every color, vivid time, moving at half speed while her body moved at double. She told Mary to ride hard, ride to Virginia City, find the U.S. Marshal, the real one, Grant Whitfield, and bring him back. She told Pete to circle behind the cabin and wait for her signal. Then she dismounted. She checked the Colt. 6 rounds. She walked toward the cabin. Through the broken door she could see them. Caleb on the floor, blood from his shoulder wound soaking through his shirt, his right hand still gripping his rifle, his face white, but his eyes burning with the concentrated fury of a man who has calculated the odds and found them unacceptable, but refuses to surrender the equation. Silas, against the far wall, hands bound, face swollen, beaten badly, but conscious, his amber eyes tracking every movement in the room. Boone stood between them, his marshal's badge gleaming on his chest, his pistol moving between the two men as though deciding which one to point at was a matter of casual preference. One remaining hired man stood near the back door, rifle in hand, watching the fire eat the wall behind him with the nervous energy of someone who had not signed up for arson. Eliza stepped through the front door. "Mrs. Hawkins," Boone said, turning. If he was surprised, his face did not show it. "Back from your ride. I was beginning to think you had left these boys to fend for themselves." "I brought something back with me," Eliza said. Her voice did not shake. She was beyond shaking. She had ridden 18 days through wilderness, found a witness everyone said was impossible to find, and she was standing in her burning home watching the 2 men she loved bleeding on the floor. Fear had gone past itself into something colder and more useful. "I brought a witness. Mary spotted elk. The woman Silas saved. She is riding to Virginia City right now to find Marshal Grant Whitfield, the real marshal, not whatever puppet Voss turned you into." Boone's smile thinned, but did not vanish. "By the time any marshal gets here, I will be long gone. With Drummond." "No," Eliza said. "You will not. Because in addition to the witness I have evidence. Your warrant was not signed by a federal judge. It was authorized by Harlan Voss, a private citizen with no judicial authority. I have read the territorial statutes, Mr. Boone. That warrant is worth less than the paper it is written on. And when Whitfield arrives, I will present him with a detailed accounting of your actions. Arson of a civilian home, assault on a former Union soldier, use of a fraudulently obtained badge, false imprisonment. Every charge carries prison time. Every charge I can document." Boone stared at her. The smile was gone now. What was underneath was not anger exactly. It was the cold recalculation of a man who has built his career on the predictability of other people's fear and is encountering perhaps for the first time someone whose fear has been burned away by something stronger. "You are bluffing," he said, but his voice had lost its polish. A gunshot cracked from behind the cabin, not close but close enough. Boone's hired man spun toward the back door, and in that moment of divided attention Caleb moved. He moved with the explosive economy of a man who has been waiting for exactly this opening, conserving strength while bleeding on the floor for precisely this half-second of distraction. The rifle came up. The barrel found the hired man's chest. "Drop it," Caleb said. 2 words. They carried more authority than a courtroom full of judges. The hired man dropped his weapon. Old Pete appeared in the back doorway, his own rifle smoking a grin splitting his white beard. "That was a warning shot," he said cheerfully. "The next one will not warn anything." Boone's gun was still pointed at Silas, but the geometry of the room had changed. Caleb's rifle was on the hired man, Pete's rifle was on Boone, and Eliza's Colt, which she had drawn without conscious thought, was aimed at the center of Boone's chest. "Put it down," Eliza said. Boone looked at her, at the gun in her hand, at her eyes which were dry and steady and absolutely certain. "You will not shoot me," he said. "You are a schoolteacher from Connecticut." "I was a schoolteacher from Connecticut," Eliza said. "Now I am a mountain man's wife, and you are standing in my home threatening my family, and I will tell you exactly once more. Put it down." Something in her voice or in her eyes or in the particular stillness of her hands on the weapon communicated what words alone could not. Fletcher Boone, who had hunted men across 5 territories, who had faced down outlaws and killers and desperate men with nothing to lose, looked at Eliza Prescott Hawkins and saw something that made him set his pistol on the floor. It was not courage that he saw. Courage is what people show when they are not sure what will happen. What Boone saw in Eliza's eyes was certainty. The absolute unshakable certainty of a woman who has found the thing worth killing for and has made her peace with the cost. They bound Boone and his man with rope from the barn. Caleb's shoulder wound was serious, but not life-threatening. The ball had gone clean through. Silas was beaten but unbroken, his amber eyes clearing as Eliza cut the ropes from his wrists with Caleb's hunting knife. The fire on the back wall was put out before it could consume the structure, leaving a black scar on the logs that would remain visible for years, a reminder of the night the family almost ended. Marshal Grant Whitfield arrived 2 days later guided by Mary Spotted Elk, who had ridden the distance to Virginia City in a time that the marshal later described as not humanly possible. Whitfield was 50 years old, iron-haired with the bearing of a man who had enforced law in territories where law was more concept than practice, and had done so without losing either his principles or his patience. The hearing was informal, conducted on the porch of the Elk Ridge General Store because the town had no courthouse and Whitfield believed that justice should be administered where it was needed rather than where it was convenient. Mary testified. She stood before the marshal and the small crowd that had gathered, her back straight, her voice clear, and she told the truth. She told it without embellishment, without drama, without the desperate plea for belief that so often undermines credibility. She simply stated what had happened to her, what Kessler had done, what Silas had done to stop it, and she stated it with the quiet authority of a woman who had survived something that should have destroyed her, and had instead become stronger for it. Eliza presented the legal arguments, the warrant's lack of proper judicial authorization, Boone's use of a badge obtained through corruption rather than appointment, the pattern of Voss using legal mechanisms as instruments of personal revenge rather than justice. She cited statutes. She referenced precedents. She spoke with the precision and confidence of someone who had spent an entire winter reading law by lamplight, not because she enjoyed it, but because the people she loved were going to need it. Whitfield listened to all of it. He asked questions. He examined the warrant. He studied Boone's badge. And when all the testimony was given and all the arguments were made, he rendered his judgment. Silas Drummond was cleared. Insufficient evidence for the robbery charge. The testimony of Mary Spotted Elk, corroborated by the documented pattern of Voss's use of legal intimidation, was sufficient to dismiss the warrant entirely. Fletcher Boone was arrested. Assault on civilians, arson of an occupied dwelling, fraudulent use of a federal badge. He would be transported to Virginia City for trial. As Boone was led away in irons, he passed Eliza. He stopped, looked at her with those small dark eyes. "Voss will not stop," he said. "I was the dog. He will send another." "Then we will be ready," Eliza said. "We were ready for you." Whitfield lingered after the hearing. He shook Eliza's hand, which was not something federal marshals typically did with women in 1878, and said, "Mrs. Hawkins, you should consider the law as a profession. You have a talent for it." "I am a teacher," Eliza said. "But my father taught me that books are not decorations. They are weapons. You just have to know which one to pick up." Whitfield looked at Caleb, who stood behind Eliza with his rifle and his scars and his silence. Then at Silas, who stood on her other side, enormous and battered and smiling for the first time in days. The marshal's eyes moved between the three of them, reading the geometry of how they stood, how close, how naturally, how completely. "You have an unusual family, Mrs. Hawkins," he said. "The best ones usually are," Eliza replied. The ride home felt different, not just because the danger had passed, or because the spring sun was warming the trail, or because the wildflowers had begun to push through the last of the snowmelt in patches of purple and gold. It felt different because something fundamental had shifted. They had been tested, not by the mountain, not by the winter, not by the complicated mathematics of three people trying to build one life. They had been tested by a man with a gun and a badge and the full weight of someone else's wealth behind him, and they had not broken. At the cabin they stood on the porch and looked at the damage, the scorched back wall, the broken door, the bullet holes in the window frame. It was not beautiful, but it was standing. "We will rebuild the wall," Caleb said. "Stronger this time," Silas added. Eliza put her arms around both of them. Caleb stiff at first, then softening, then leaning into her the way a tree leans toward light. Silas wrapping his enormous arms around them both, pulling them close, holding them together. "Stronger," Eliza agreed. The years that followed were not without difficulty. No life worth living ever is. But the difficulties were the ordinary kind, the kind that come from weather and sickness, and the relentless demands of survival in a territory that had not yet decided whether it was wilderness or civilization. Caleb and Silas opened a timber operation. Silas built furniture tables and chairs and bed frames that were so well crafted people rode from 50 miles away to buy them. Caleb felled and milled the lumber, working with the silent intensity that was his signature, producing boards so straight and true they might have been drawn with a ruler. The operation grew. They hired men. They earned a reputation. Eliza opened a school. It started in the cabin's main room, 3 children from Elk Ridge whose parents were willing to send them up the mountain. Within a year she had 12 students. Within 3 years the town built her a proper schoolhouse, a small wooden building with windows that Silas had framed and a door that Caleb had hung. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and one subject that was not in any official curriculum. She taught her students to think, to question, to read not just words, but the intentions behind them. She taught them that a book could be a weapon and a shield, and a door depending on how you held it. The first child came in the 2nd year, a girl. They named her Hope because that is what she represented, the visible proof that what they had built was not just an arrangement, but a family. Hope had Silas's mahogany hair, Eliza's blue-gray eyes, and from birth, Caleb's stubborn refusal to cry when things hurt. She was perfect. Thomas came 2 years later. Black-haired, gray-eyed, built lean and quick. Caleb's son in every visible way, though no one said it aloud because it did not need to be said. Silas taught him to carve before he could write his name. Caleb taught him to track before he could ride. Lily arrived 2 years after Thomas. Amber-eyed, round-faced, with a laugh so loud and infectious that it could be heard from the porch when she was playing by the creek. She was unmistakably Silas's, and Silas, who had spent his entire adult life convinced that he did not deserve permanence, carried her everywhere, as though she were proof that the universe had changed its mind about him. All 3 children called both men Pa Caleb and Pa Silas. It was not confusing. It was simply the truth presented in the language of children, which is always more honest than the language of adults. The town adjusted. This is the thing about communities on the frontier. They are built by people who have already rejected the rules of the places they came from. People who walked away from something, toward something, through something. Elk Ridge had its share of gossips and its share of moralists, but it also had its share of people who understood that happiness, real happiness, was rare enough that it should not be destroyed simply because it came in an unexpected shape. When Caleb pulled the Harmon boy from the river during spring flooding, carrying the unconscious child a mile uphill to the doctor on a leg that was cramping and a shoulder that still ached from the bullet wound, the whispers about the Hawkins family got quieter. When Silas built a coffin for the Miller widow at no charge and sat with her children through the night because no one else would, the whispers got quieter still. And when Eliza taught the Blackwood girl to read well enough to write a letter to her father in prison, a letter so articulate that the warden read it aloud to the other guards, and 3 of them wept, the whispers stopped entirely. Reverend Hartley, the old man whose trembling hands had started all of this, became the family's most unexpected defender. He told his congregation one Sunday, in a voice that shook not from age, but from conviction that God judges hearts, not paperwork, and that he had never seen a family love each other more completely than the Hawkins family on the mountain. 2 parishioners walked out, the rest stayed, and the next Sunday both of the ones who had walked out came back. Hope was 10 when she asked the question. She was sitting at the kitchen table doing arithmetic, her mahogany hair in 2 braids, her brow furrowed with the particular intensity of a child working through a problem that the numbers themselves cannot solve. "Mama," she said, "Pa Caleb and Pa Silas are both my father, not just my uncle." It was not a question. It was a statement. Children see what adults spend enormous energy pretending is not there. Eliza set down the dish she was drying. She sat across from her daughter and looked into those blue-gray eyes that were her own and said, "Yes." "And you love them both?" "Yes." "And they love each other?" "Yes." Hope considered this. The arithmetic forgotten. The problem she was solving now was larger than numbers. "Then I have more love than the other children," she said. Eliza's eyes filled. "Yes, sweetheart, you do." "Good," Hope said, and went back to her arithmetic. Thomas and Lily, when they were old enough, arrived at the same understanding with the same untroubled acceptance. They had grown up inside it. It was simply the shape of their world, the way the mountain was a shape, and the river was a shape, and the cabin was a shape. You do not question the architecture of the only home you have ever known. 20 years. Eliza was 42. Her chestnut hair had threads of silver running through it, concentrated at the temples. Her hands, which had been soft and pale when she arrived in Montana, were strong now, capable, marked with small scars from cooking fires and carpentry and the 1,000 practical injuries of a life lived in physical contact with the world. She was beautiful in the way that landscapes are beautiful, not because of any single feature, but because everything fit together in a way that suggested design rather than accident. Caleb was 53. His black hair had gone iron gray. The scar on his face had faded from white to silver. His body was still lean, still capable, but slower now, the shoulder wound aching in cold weather, his back protesting the decades of physical labor. He still rose before dawn, still split wood with precise economical strokes, still spoke in sentences that rarely exceeded 10 words. But his eyes, those gray-blue eyes that had once been as cold and hard as the color they resembled, had warmth in them now. Not much. Not in a way that strangers would notice, but enough that Eliza could see it, and Silas could see it, and their children could see it, and that was everyone who mattered. Silas was 55. His mahogany hair was streaked heavily with gray. His enormous frame had thickened his belly, rounded by years of his own excellent cooking. He still laughed easily, still sang while he worked, still told stories that lasted entire evenings. But the nightmares had stopped. Not gradually, not through effort, but all at once on a night 7 years ago when a letter arrived from Mary Spotted Elk. She had married a Crow man named Runs Far. She had 2 children. She was happy. And at the bottom of the letter, in her neat mission school handwriting, she had written, "You came in time. Stop caring what I have already set down." Silas had read the letter, folded it carefully, placed it in the drawer where he kept Eliza's antler ring when she was not wearing it, and that night he slept through until morning without a sound. He never had the nightmare again. Autumn. The aspens on the mountainside were turning gold for the 20th time since Eliza had arrived. The cabin, which had been expanded 3 times and now resembled a small ranch house more than the 2-room structure she had first entered, glowed in the evening light. Hope was 20, studying nursing, and Helena letters, arriving every week, filled with questions about anatomy and complaints about the cold. Thomas was 18, already taller than Silas, running the timber operation with the quiet competence he had inherited from Caleb. Lily was 16, writing letters to a young man in Bozeman that all 3 parents read when she was not looking, and all 3 parents worried about in equal measure. The evening was warm. Eliza sat on the porch between her 2 husbands, her head resting on Caleb's shoulder, her feet in Silas's lap. Below them the valley spread out like a painting, the river catching the last light, the town twinkling with lamp glow, the mountains standing around them like sentinels. 20 years, Eliza said. 20 years, Caleb said, since I saw you step down from that coach and forgot everything I thought I knew about being alive. 20 years, Silas said, since I learned that family is not something you are born into. It is something you choose to build. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of 20 years of mornings and evenings, of births and fevers, of arguments about money and reconciliations by firelight, of the sound of children growing and the sound of 2 men learning that love does not diminish when it is divided, but multiplies when it is shared. Full of the memory of a burning cabin and a woman with a Colt and a law book who had ridden 400 miles to save what mattered. Full of gratitude so deep it had no bottom, only surface, and the surface was every day they had been given together. Eliza closed her eyes and breathed in the smell of pine and wood smoke and autumn and the particular warm scent that was 2 men who had been working all day and had not yet washed, and she thought, this is it. This is the whole thing. Every minute of the last 20 years, every mile of the 2,000 that brought me here, every page of every law book, every bullet in every chamber, every tear and every laugh, and every night tangled together in that ridiculous bed that Silas built too large on purpose, it was all for this porch, this view, these hands, this life. I do not need to wish for anything, she said aloud. Then do not wish, Caleb said. Just stay. Where else would I go? Eliza said. Everything I have is right here. Silas took her hand. Caleb took the other. The mountain held them in its palm, the way it had held them for 20 years, steady and patient and indifferent to the opinions of a world that had never climbed high enough to see the view. Below them, Elk Ridge was settling into evening. Somewhere in town, Reverend Hartley was reading by candlelight, his old eyes finally at peace with the mistake that had turned out to be the best thing he had ever done. Somewhere in Helena, Hope was studying a medical textbook and thinking about coming home for Christmas. Somewhere on the road from Bozeman, a letter was traveling toward Lily that would make her blush and make all 3 of her parents pretend they had not read it. And on the mountain in the cabin that had been burned and rebuilt and expanded and filled with the noise and chaos and absolute relentless love of a family that should not have existed but did, 3 people held hands in the fading light and said nothing, because everything that needed to be said had been said 20 years ago on a night when the snow was falling and a schoolteacher from Connecticut had looked at 2 wounded men and chosen both. And that is the story of Eliza Prescott Hawkins. A girl who sold everything she owned and traveled 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, who found 2 strangers instead, who caught a fever that broke down the walls between them, who learned to shoot and ride and argue law and love without reservation and fight for her family with everything she had and everything she was. She arrived in Montana as a mail-order bride. She became a wife, a mother, a teacher, a lawyer, in everything but title, and the beating heart of a family that proved for anyone willing to see that love does not follow rules. It follows truth, and truth, when you are brave enough to live inside it, will build you a home that no storm can break. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you chose truth over convention? When was the last time you stood your ground? Not because it was easy, not because the world approved, but because the people you love were standing behind you and the only direction that mattered was forward. If this story meant something to you, hit the like button. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories like this one. And leave a comment. Tell me where you are watching from. Tell me what time it is where you are. I read every single one, because one misaddressed letter turned a desperate girl into a bride. A fever turned a bride into a lover. And courage plain. Ordinary courage, the kind that does not ask for applause, turned a lover into the foundation of a family that lasted longer than the mountains they lived on. It is never too late to choose a better way forward. The cabin on the mountain still stands. The porch still faces the valley. And if you listen carefully on autumn evenings, when the aspens turn to gold, you can almost hear them. 3 voices, laughing, together, the way they were always meant to be.